We interrupt this series on American history to bring you the latest news from Mansa Musa's pilgrimage. Okay, maybe not the latest news. It was 700 years ago. Between 1312 and 1337 CE, a ruler named Mansa Musa ruled over West Africa's Mali Empire. During his reign, he expanded the reach of the empire to control massive deposits of salt and gold. This made Mansa Musa very, very wealthy. You think Jeff Bezos is wealthy? Imagine an infinite number of Jeff Bezoses. Bezai? Whatever, it's not important. Musa was also a devout Muslim. So in 1324 CE, Musa completed the Hajj, or pilgrimage, to Mecca, and his journey became the stuff of legend. He brought with him the riches of his empire and an entire entourage. Upon his return, Musa's beliefs impacted the way he ordered his rule. For example, Islam requires its followers to care for the poor, so Musa became widely known for his generosity and charity. In Egypt, he gave away so much gold that it even disrupted the Egyptian economy. His wealth and power amazed Europeans and led to centuries of fascination with the city of Timbuktu. You may be wondering why we're starting this episode in Africa and not, say, America. Well, American history isn't just limited to the American continents, just like it doesn't begin at Lexington and Concord. So far, we've explored the histories of indigenous societies across America. And like the Hohokam and ancestral Puebloans in the South, or Algonquian in the North, those societies existed across modern-day borders and national boundaries. The cultures we're going to talk about in this episode are similar in that aspect, but we're going way outside of the US boundaries for this one. That's right, we're going across the pond to explore West Africa and Western Europe in the 15th century. I'm Dr. Danielle Bainbridge, and this is Study Hall, US History to 1865. European, African, and indigenous cultures have been contributing to what we call American culture for as long as all three have been on the continent. And West Africa and Western Europe, the regions we'll be focusing on today, actually had quite a bit in common with one another. And while in the 14th and 15th century, Africans and Europeans lived in a very different world than us, we'll see here the ways that both contributed to creating a distinctly unique American culture. Believe it or not, 15th century Western Europe and 15th century West Africa actually had quite a bit in common. Living conditions were awful. I mean, really awful. People had to fend off war, disease, malnutrition, violence, backbreaking labor, and all kinds of accidents. Throughout the 14th century, Europe was devastated by the bubonic plague, which killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the entire European population, or in scientific terms, too many people. In both Europe and Africa, childbirth was highly risky. In fact, most parents could expect to see many of their children die before the age of 2. And many of the children who did survive grew up without at least one parent and probably never met any of their grandparents. There was even overlap in belief systems between the continents. That's because both regions were home to major monotheistic religions. Monotheism refers to a religious belief in only one God. In Western Europe, Christianity was the dominant monotheistic religion. In West Africa, Islam was popular, evidenced by Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca. Both 15th century Western Europe and West Africa also boasted great diversity in languages and cultures. The Igbo people were different from Mansa Musa's Malian Empire, which was also different from the Songhai Empire, which stretched from the Atlantic coast inland along the Niger River. For instance, Mansa Musa would likely have spoken a Manding language. On the other hand, Songhai ruler Askia Muhammad likely spoke a language from the Aniha family. In Western Europe, there were languages still taught in American high schools today: Latin, French, English, Spanish, and German. And if you go to a really cool high school, Portuguese and Flemish. Social classes were also familiar. In both West Africa and Western Europe, the populations had their fair share of the super rich and poor. But the kingdoms of these regions would not have resembled modern-day countries or nations. For example, in 15th century Timbuktu or London, citizens might be under greater control, since those cities were the kingdom's center. The goals of these kingdoms were simple: to expand geographically, build wealth, and accumulate power. And that's where warfare came in. Mali's Mansa Musa and France's Charles VII both established regular standing armies. In Europe, the 100 Years' War between 1337 and 1453 made it necessary to have an army ready at all times just in case of conflict. And for those keeping score at home, the 100 Years' War was indeed 116 years, not 100. Close enough. And in West Africa, standing armies were necessary to protect trade networks, which were crucial to the West African economy. But despite these commonalities, Western Europe and Western Africa were very different places. So let's break down each region individually. In Western Europe, monarchy ruled. At the top were kings and queens, the monarchs. In the middle, you had lesser nobles who were given tracts of land by the king and queen. They had fancy titles like duke, baron, countess, and earl. Also in the middle were knights and members of the clergy, which, until the 1500s, was mainly the Catholic Church. And to be clear, one didn't just work their way up to become a bishop or knight. Members of this class were usually already upper class, but not firstborn, meaning they were unlikely to inherit much. And way down at the bottom were peasants. Peasants worked the land for dukes and barons and had little to no shot at climbing the social ladder. But for the king and queen, more nobles meant less power. That's because power was generally measured by wealth and land ownership. And if you're running the country like Oprah, where you get a parcel of land and you get a parcel of land, then you're gonna run out of power real quick. So in order to stay wealthy and by extension keep their power, kings and queens needed to make money. And that meant raising taxes. And sometimes taxes could lead to big, bloody problems, like England's Peasants' Revolt at the end of the 14th century. Taxation causing problems for England? Rings a bell. A Liberty Bell. So to get around the taxation problem, monarchs were always looking for alternative ways to build their wealth. And around the same time, European sailors got much better at their craft, figuring out how to use the Atlantic Ocean's currents to travel farther and farther from home. In the 15th century, Spanish and Portuguese sailors and soldiers began to colonize the Canary Islands and build large plantations dedicated to growing sugarcane. The invasion and colonization decimated the island's indigenous population, known as the Guanche. After the Canary Islands, Europeans rode the currents to Africa and eventually the Americas. And while it's a mistake to assign any one motive, it's not hard to imagine that in these, quote, new lands, European monarchs saw colonization as a way to grow their own riches in a way that didn't involve taxing its people. And more money meant more power for the monarchy. And more power meant the ability to finance further colonial efforts, which meant more money and more power. It was a devastating cycle. Like Western Europe, West Africa featured many different kingdoms of varying sizes, and the form of government in these kingdoms varied as well. Some kingdoms, like the Mali Empire, probably looked a lot like a European monarchy. In fact, the word Mansa, as in Mansa Musa, is often translated into king or emperor. But in other societies like the Hausa, who lived in modern-day Nigeria, power was spread out across a group of city-states, each of which had its own ruler. And unlike Western Europe, wealth in West Africa wasn't measured in land ownership. Instead, it was measured by the ownership of labor. Slave labor to be exact. The way this looked varied between societies. In some, like the West African Mandinka, enslaved persons could not be bought or sold outside of one's respective village after a few generations. In other areas, like the Hausa city of Zaza, trading enslaved persons for resources like horses and firearms was common. In other cases, slaves were themselves wealthy and powerful. Military commanders, for example, might be enslaved. But much more common were enslaved persons making up a kingdom's primary labor force. In the Songhai Empire, for example, enslaved persons farmed land, providing food for the kingdom. Greater control over labor meant greater power and prestige for a kingdom's ruling class. And the easiest way to increase the forced labor supply was through war. Captured prisoners of war often became enslaved persons. European slave traders would later take advantage of this pre-existing slave system, tapping into these networks across West Africa with the help of African rulers. In both Western Europe and West Africa, rulers were constantly looking for ways to increase their power. In Africa, it meant increasing the forced labor supply. In Europe, it meant finding alternative ways to increase financial wealth and land control. And this drive would transform Africa, Europe, and the Americas. It led to colonization and the creation of the slave trade. So far, we've only really examined those regions before they collided. And the societies that existed in those places were complex, molded by each distinct geography, climate, and culture. And these societies were also focused on increasing their own power or limiting the power of others over them. We may think of them as unrecognizable from each other or ourselves today, but understanding the history of these societies is crucial to understanding the worlds and cultures they would help create and shape in America. It's almost like history is just as much about the present as it is the past. Sounds familiar. Thanks for watching Study Hall U.S. History to 1865, which is part of the Study Hall Project, a partnership between ASU and Crash Course. If you like this video and want to keep learning with us, be sure to subscribe. You can learn more about Study Hall and the videos produced by Crash Course and ASU in the links in the description. See you next time.